So welcome back. Sorry for that little technical glitch. We love technology, but sometimes it doesn't always love us back. I was just getting ready to introduce my good friend Christie Appelhanz, who is the Executive Director of the Children's Alliance of Kansas. We started working with Christie a few years ago as part of a Kansas Health Foundation equity grant, and I'm really glad that we got to meet her and learn about the great work that they're doing here in Kansas. Thank you for joining us today. Could you tell our audience a little bit about your work?
I will, but I first want to tell the audience that it's your birthday, and I brought you a cupcake, so happy birthday.
Well, perfect. I was hoping for a cupcake today, so you made my day.
Well, you got one. So the Children's Alliance is an organization that's been around since 1956, and we are a group of providers who work in a variety of different ways to strengthen families across Kansas. So everything from foster care to substance use treatment to mental health services. Our goal is really to shape public policy that puts families in the best position they can be in Kansas.
Tell me a little bit about your role within the organization.
So I'm the Executive Director of the Children's Alliance of Kansas. I've been doing that for about 3 years. And so I spend a lot of time at the Statehouse making sure that we have policies and funding so we're best able to meet the needs of children and families in Kansas.
Will you let the audience know how they can connect with your work?
Well, absolutely. So one of the things we're really focusing on is the fact that we have a record number of kids in the child welfare system right now. We've had as high as 7,600 kids in foster care, and we currently have about 7,300 kids in foster care. We have a system in Kansas that was really built for about 4,000 or 4,500 kids. So one of the things we're really working on is making sure that people understand the need to prevent kids from needing to be put in foster care. So making sure that families have the resources to stay together. And so we are working to fund the new Federal Family First Prevention Services Act, which would provide families things like parent education, mental health services, and substance use treatment. And so we're really looking for people to help us spread that message.
You know, it's interesting, as you all know, and Christie, as you know, this is a part of the wealth work that we do: water, energy, air, land, transportation, and health. I think there may be some folks in the audience thinking, wow, foster care system and kids, you know, how does that align with the wealth priorities? Could you talk a little bit about how you see your work aligning with wealth?
Sure. Well, I think the biggest way is that children in the child welfare system always have health issues. They have experienced trauma, and in some cases they have experienced physical harm, as well as the trauma their families have experienced. So everything that we do as part of child welfare is really a health issue. There's also a lot of overlap between the environment and child welfare when it comes to disproportionality and racial equity. We have serious problems in the child welfare system. Black children are 75% more likely to come into foster care than white children. And so I know that you're working to address racial disproportionality, and so I think that's an area where we also share, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's no doubt that we know that you don't see a lot of fossil fuel generation, coal plants or natural gas plants in the middle of affluent white neighborhoods. Unfortunately, environmental justice is an issue. Black children in Kansas and really across the United States are more impacted by respiratory illnesses from coal plants like asthma at a much higher level than our white children in our state. And so that certainly is an area where we have some connections between the wealth priorities and the work that the Kansas Alliance does. When we think about the health piece, which I think is where we really see our intersection of our work, are there other parts that you see that connection on the health side?
Well, so we're talking a lot, particularly this week as the legislature looks at budgets, about how are we funding the continuum of care for children's mental health needs. Every day in Kansas, we have 150 children who are on a wait list for psychiatric residential treatment facilities. These are the facilities that serve our kids who have experienced the most extreme forms of trauma, and they have been deemed unable to stay safely in their home until they can be stabilized and treated. Right now in the budget, we have $0 in the budget to address a waiting list of 150 kids. It's a pretty scary time to be a child welfare worker when they are forced to kind of work with children who could harm themselves or harm others. So we are working hard to make sure that there is funding to address the waiting list, build the capacities, so we're addressing all of the continuum of care. And it really is important because when kids can't get into the level of care that they need, it takes away, they move down to a lower level of care, and then that takes away spots, and then we move kids down. And so at all levels of the system, we're seeing children and youth who just are experiencing a higher acuity of needs, who aren't getting the right care at the right time.
We know through our work on climate change that children and the elderly are going to be the most impacted by climate impacts as we move forward. And so it really behooves us to all be thinking about those impacts on the most vulnerable among us, the children. And it's so interesting. Last year, you may recall, we had NAMI of Kansas on as our guest, one of our first Facebook Lives, and they were talking about the way that people deal with stress and anxiety, and the stress and anxiety that can come from thinking about this huge issue around climate change and what are we going to do moving forward. And so mental health services for kids, but also for others, is going to be really key as we're moving forward. Definitely something that we have in common. The other thing that I think is important for us to think about are what are the policy activities. You've talked about a couple that you all have going specifically that are impacting the Kansas Alliance and Kansas kids and families. There are a few more that we are watching from the energy side. Many of you know that there was a wind energy bill that would have created really damaging setbacks and made local control for counties you basically go away. House Bill 2273 was heard last week, and fortunately citizens made their voices heard, and there were lots of people that testified, and ultimately that bill was defeated. So wind energy is going to keep moving forward in Kansas, so that was good. There is a bill, Senate Bill 69, which is looking for a study, an electricity study bill that is still in play after what we call turnaround happens this week. And I'm going to let Christie talk about turnaround in just a minute, so bookmark that. But it is, talking about what are we going to do about electricity rates and studying some issues. But the thing that we're really working hard on is Senate Bill 124, which is going to try to get rid of new charges for people who want to generate their own power with solar or small wind. And so, be sure to sign up at climateandenergy.org for more of those kinds of updates. But I think the thing that we really share and we're really thinking about when it comes to wealth is Medicaid expansion. What's going on there?
Well, there's certainly, we know that Kansans want to expand Medicaid. There's been survey after survey I think the advocates have done a fantastic job of really making the case of why this makes sense, as we've seen other states expand Medicaid and we see the benefits. And there's surprising benefits too. In states that have expanded Medicaid, we're actually seeing fewer kids come into the foster care system, which isn't surprising because when caregivers have access to health, it's more likely that children will also get to go to the doctor and take advantage of that. So we now have a governor who is supportive of Medicaid expansion. The question really is, under the dome at the Statehouse, will there be an opportunity for these bills to move this session? And there are some in the legislature who are certainly fighting against the will of their constituents on this issue that could make such an impact in so many different areas. So people are hopeful. There's a lot of talk. There's just a lot of hope for what may happen with Medicaid expansion this year.
I really think it's interesting. I mentioned the word turnaround, and then I realized that I'm talking in some lobbyist jargon, and people probably don't all know what that means. So will you tell folks about turnaround, what that means?
Sure. So turnaround is generally the halfway point of the legislative session. We have a 90-day session in Kansas, and so this is a really significant deadline where bills must be across either the House or Senate in order to remain alive. But like everything else in the legislature, there's always ways around that. So there are certain committees that are exempt from the rules, and you can also get a bill blessed. So if your bills haven't gone just yet, it's not as if all hope is lost, but this is a really important deadline. And so committee work in many of the committees ended yesterday, and the legislature is spending the next 3 days on the floor of the House and the Senate, really moving bills across the floor, voting on bills, and kind of getting ready for that next step in the session.
Thank you for that great explanation. So I've been a little remiss. We have Leilani with us doing our tech today. Thanks, Leilani. Checking in to see if there are some questions from the audience that we might answer, but then also to remind you, if you're watching this later, if you're not watching live today, go ahead and put your questions in the chat box, because we will review them, and if they're questions for us, we'll answer them. If they're questions for Christie, we'll send her a note and get her answers as well. So Leilani, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. We have a question from Courtney Masterson. She asked the question, how might local professionals provide education for children on various climate change issues? For example, native plant education.
Ooh, that's a good question. I think it's more of a question in my capacity as a school board member than maybe in my capacity as a Children's Alliance executive director, but I believe that teachers are always looking for outside experts to come in and share their expertise with kids. So I think that could be through our public education system, or I think that could be through some of our after-school programs, such as the Boys and Girls Club. I would give whatever community you're in, just get in contact with the people who are involved with kids, because I would want to come hear about that. So I assume everyone would.
And I might add to that, one way would be to work with Casey, and I'm not going to get the acronym right, but maybe Leilani will put it in the chat box, the Kansas Association of Conservation and Environment Educators, I believe, and Laura Downey, if I butchered that, my apologies, please. Casey does some great work around education for the environment. I would also say one of the things we've been talking about as wealth partners, water, energy, air, land, transportation, and health, for quite a while is, how do we put together a wealth curriculum guide where we can provide wealth topics and plans for teachers that would meet the education standards that the state has. I think it's a great opportunity, and Courtney, if you are interested in that, reach out and let's talk more about how to make something like that happen. So I want to move on now, if I could, to civic engagement and ask Christie, what are your top tips for civic engagement or for effective advocacy strategies for individuals?
I think my tip really is just do it. We have found as a child welfare community that for far too long we sat back and just hoped that everyone would do the right thing. And we have really started to understand that people can't do the right thing unless they have the right information. And it's our job as advocates to tell the story. Tell the story as a foster parent, tell the story as a social worker, tell the story as a mental health practitioner. We have to share with the legislators and our elected officials what we see on the ground so they can make sure that they're funding things, and to never be afraid to share from your point of view. And if you're not sure if you should share something or not, I'd say share it. If you're not sure if you should invite someone to have them see what kind of programs you have, I'd say put out an invitation. I think it's really important that we stay informed and that we are letting people know what we see.
That's great advice. I would say it's so interesting the impact those personal stories can be. Having had 70 people at the Statehouse yesterday, all talking about the impacts on their lives of these solar charges that we're seeing. Legislators really are able to see that these are real people with real impacts. And so I agree wholeheartedly with Christie. Anytime you can tell your story, that's so important. So you've got a captive audience. What question would you ask a legislator about your policy priorities, either yourself, or what would you want our audience to ask legislators about your policy priorities?
So I believe we have a tremendous opportunity. We talk a lot about fixing foster care, and I think with this new federal legislation called Family First that really allows us to invest in before child maltreatment happens, I would really ask a legislator, what are your thoughts on Family First? How can we make this work? Are you willing to invest in keeping families together? And if not, why not? So I think there's such an opportunity here for us to change the way we have been really approaching children and families.
I think the other piece that we certainly hope you all are asking your legislators is, as it relates to health today, what's the holdup on Medicaid expansion? Everybody wants it. We're all working hard. We want to see Kansans have access to health care. So what's the holdup on that would be something I might also add.
And I think a good question to always ask legislators is, what are the things they're interested in? Because it's hard to believe, no matter what they're interested in, it's going to connect to the environment in some way. It's going to connect to children and families in some way. So I think sometimes that's the best question I ask, is finding out what they care about and approaching it from their own self-interest.
That's a great tip for us all to remember. So last year, we really encouraged people to register to vote, and we saw great turnout in Kansas. We think it's really important to maintain voter engagement between elections. So how can people get involved on your issues beyond either the campaigns or the legislative sessions in your mind?
So I think there's a couple of ways. One is when they're not in session, I think it's a great opportunity to get to know your legislators, to invite them to an event about the environment, or invite them to a service provider dealing with kids in the child welfare system. But I also think it's important to really get involved on, for me in child welfare, we always need foster parents. And if you can't be a foster parent, you can support a foster parent. You can bring them dinner. You can offer to provide respite care for their families. You can make sure that kids have a birthday cake on their birthdays and a present to open. So there's so many ways to be involved, and I think that helps you become a better advocate as you're engaged in the community, engaged with the people affected by these issues, and then we can work to start making things better.
So I'll ask any other questions from the audience at this point?
No, but I do have a question.
Okay,
Oh.
good. One for Leilani.
So how would one be able to find out what these foster families need, and how can we support, being supportive of that?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. So we have 18 members of the Children's Alliance of Kansas, and they're all listed on our website at childally.org. If you go to our members section, and they are serving children and families across the state of Kansas. And so you could look at any of the agencies we have, where they're headquartered at, and that would be a good place to start. And they all have different needs, no matter what you're willing to give or whatever way you're willing to serve. I bet they can put you to work. I just know it.
Wonderful, wonderful. Do you have any upcoming events that you want to share before we talk a little bit about Wealth Day?
I'll be at Wealth Day, so I'd want to hear about that event.
Okay, terrific. Well, just reminding everyone, March 12th is our annual day of advocacy. We are still looking for sponsors, so if you're an organization who would like to host a table to talk about your wealth topic or your wealth priority, if you can't table and you just want to support the effort, we certainly will happily take your donations that will help pay for the local foods lunch and conversation cookies. Lots of opportunities there. We're looking for advocates, people who are passionate about the things that we all care about: water, energy, air, land, transportation, or health, be it children's health or the health generally of Kansans. Please join us. The sign up will be in the chat box. Also be sure to follow us on Facebook or Twitter at CEP Heartland to be able to see when our next activities are happening and check out the schedule for the rest of the CEP Lives. Our next interview will feature Dawn Bueller, Friends of the Caw, on March 5th at 2 p.m. What final thoughts? Anything else you want to share that we didn't cover today?
Well, this has been fun. My first job in politics was as a conservation organizer for the Sierra Club, and it just seems as if I never really left that work because we're still fighting for strong families, we're still fighting for health, and so I just appreciate this opportunity.
Well, and we're so excited that Christie decided to share her first live Facebook Live experience with us. As always, thanks for helping us preserve our Kansas wealth and lead the way to a clean energy future.